This week's mock interview is a senior product manager, and the leadership principle that we're targeting today is R right a lot. The question asked of this candidate is, tell me about a time where you had to make a decision when there wasn't enough data or benchmarks. The point of these sorts of questions is to really understand the judgment of the candidate, to understand how they make decisions, what data they use to make decisions, and whether or not they can support their decisions with, data, benchmarks, facts, etc., and explain the what and the why of their decision making. Where candidates tend to fall apart in these sorts of questions is they speak in very vague or general terms, or when it comes down to it, they don't actually present any data that they used to make their decisions. They think they're presenting data, but they don't. So we're going to jump right into it. And as per always with these interviews, what I do is I play them back as they happen and jump in from time to time with commentary so you understand in real time what I was thinking as an interviewer, why I asked the follow-up questions that I did, and how you as a candidate might be able to tweak your answers to make them better and overperform in your job interviews. As always, if you would like to sign up for your free mock interview or use any of the tools that we make available at interviewat.com, please visit the website, and hopefully we have something there for you. And for this one, I want you to talk to me about a product decision for which that you were responsible for which there wasn't enough data or benchmarks in order for you to make what you felt like was, kind of a well-informed decision, right? You still had to make a decision. So in the absence of sufficient data, what guided your choice and how did you make the call?
Can I take a second to think
Of course.
through? Cool. So, and I just want to pare it back just so I get it. I had to make a decision, but I felt like I didn't necessarily have enough data to make maybe
That's
the
correct.
best. Okay.
Funnily enough, I get this question often in the follow-up sessions and people who send me email questions and whatnot, and sometimes even in the comments in these videos is, can you ask for more time? Can you ask for time to collect your thoughts, right? Yes, 100%, absolutely. Ask for the time you need. Don't abuse it, but yes, collecting your thoughts is totally fine. Writing down notes is totally fine. It's not going to hurt you in an interview situation. If an interviewer is going to penalize you for that, you probably don't really want to work there anyway, because at the end of the day, you're trying to solve the question of, can you do this job at this company and overperform for the level that they're expecting? That's it. So if you need an extra second to collect your thoughts and make sure that you can talk in a cohesive and coherent way, take the moment. The other thing that this candidate did, which I appreciate always, is they restated the question just to make sure they have it correctly. It's a little thing that you can do, but it always makes sure that you're on the same page with the interviewer.
But I'm not responsible for that decision, so I don't necessarily want to go with that one. I think what I'll go with in the interest of time is I was on this product called, it was a new product. And what we were trying to do was build a business case and justify essentially to a business unit why they should take on the cost of this build. So I'll start with a little bit more on what it is. Online notarization would completely take the specific notary in person out of the equation. You could do it all digitally. It was during the pandemic. It was a time when all branches were closed, and furthermore, things were becoming more and more digital. So we saw an opportunity to be innovative, possibly on behalf of the client. Where I don't think we had the data around online notarization was just how many people would really adopt it to offset the cost. And when I think back as to why maybe folks didn't buy, essentially people did not decide to fund ultimately, is because we were just pushing forward. Hey, we should build this now. We should build this now. We should build this now, but not with a compelling case of like, hey, the adoption rate and cost and adoption will be these sorts of things. And also, here is how long it's going to take us to build. This is how it's going to differentiate us as a firm. I feel like we're really lacking data on how we would justify the cost ultimately, because we didn't have any tests or anything around adoption rate. It was that new. There was a lot of questions around whether or not it would really be the thing to build right now.
So there's a little bit of confusion in this answer, right? The candidate is walking through a decision to focus on a new feature in notarization online, e-notarization, and that's fine, but the candidate isn't really clear about what metrics they were missing to make the decision, right? What's really odd about this as a story selection is that the space for e-notarization, it wasn't new, right? It wasn't, especially during the pandemic, right? It wasn't a new thing, right? They weren't inventing the future. And so there were certainly market participants from whom they could kind of discern whether or not this was a good feature to add or not, and whether or not to question whether it makes sense for their customer base. But there's also the opportunity, given the size of the firm that this person works for, to kind of talk to their customers. And none of that was really covered out here. It was more just like, well, we didn't have the data, which is, it's a little bit of a strange setup, which kind of sets up the reasoning for the question that I asked as a follow-up here. Okay, but given that it was the front end of COVID, right, and it was kind of, obviously there's a lot of stuff that just we didn't know what we didn't know. But were there, I guess that's the way to ask it. Were there data points in the marketplace that suggested this was a viable path, or were you guys pioneering and cutting a new path?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. There were mature vendors, right? So a lot of what we had to influence was, how can we maybe convince this is an acceptable risk. It's being done out there. It's something that's worth paying for and something that can serve clients. And that's, I think we kind of, in a lot of ways, fell short. I also feel like we had a business case in that we knew we could save X amount of money with straight process automation. So meaning like people would have every single paper had to be notarized and processed when submitted to an office. There was going to be $1 cost savings there. Pretty much, like, no matter where you cut it in people, no longer having to process those sorts of things. But we could not really influence broad enough to our stakeholders that, hey, you should take this on and build it. And I think the one thing that might have been able to put us over the edge is if we actually did an MVP quickly and just tested to see the kind of volumes we would get.
This is actually what this candidate is describing is actually how a lot of engineers fall down in their thinking. And I say this as someone who has extensive engineering background and has worked with many engineering teams, but a general kind of junior engineer lens on the world is, build something cool, right? Customers will follow, or delaying any market fit analysis, right, ahead of just building something because it sounds cool. And in this specific case, what the candidate is really missing is that they're not really talking through the data that they could have used to make a smart decision, right? He kind of talks a little bit about cost savings, but there's no specifics in those metrics, right? So how many pieces of paper were processed? How many customers did this impact? What was the use case? How much money was spent? How much, there's a lot of FAQ type questions that I, as a leader, would ask in this interview if we were going deep on just this one question. We can, in the mock interviews, I try to cover at least 6 different questions to give as much ground as I can to give as much feedback to the candidate as possible. But in this specific instance, what I'm hoping for from a candidate is to go just a little bit deeper and provide actual metrics, specifically when the question that was asked was, walk me through a decision you made where you didn't have enough metrics or benchmarks. And he's not really speaking to, this is what we were missing. And then he immediately goes to, well, maybe it would have been better if we had an MVP. That's kind of an if you build it, they will come mentality, especially when you're trying to convince your stakeholders versus showing up with a reasoned approach of like, okay, here's why this is an important problem. Here's how many customers it's impacting. Here's how much this is costing us per year. Here's how much it would cost to develop this if we kind of went mainline with it. And here's how much money we would ultimately save, which would drop to the bottom line. I mean, these are simple questions that as a product manager, you should be thinking to ask. And as this candidate is a product manager, he's failing to deliver on that.
Then I would have more numbers to say, hey, we got 10% adoption. We're not marketing it all on this single form that's the highest volume. It's going to pay for itself. And I do think it's bad too with the TDA and Schwab conversion. That's where resources were going. We probably should have recognized that sooner. Just pivoted earlier.
But so just as someone who has done notarizations in the past and just what a pain it is to find a person who can do it, blah, blah, blah. I recognize that it's a process that can draw a lot of anxiety from customers who are trying to purchase a home or do any number of things where you need a notary. But I guess I'm confused here because the way you're walking me through this, you're saying you didn't have enough data. There were mature vendors in the marketplace, which says to me that's a piece of data, right? But as a company, surely you have internal offices and a field office. I don't know what the right word is. I'm going to say field office owners who you could reach out to and say, help me understand how many notarizations need to happen within your four walls in a given week. And then from that, extrapolating out, or even like doing a survey of customers, because I would imagine they're tracking what kinds of transactions require notaries, and so you could do a survey of the customers. So there's any number of ways you could have kind of gathered data, but what you're telling me is, or what you've said multiple times in this answer, is that you didn't have any data, and there was no way to get data. But I just kind of just rattled off two very quick ones based on what you've said. So I don't understand. I want you to support the statement that you didn't have enough data.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense, because all the things you said are true. And I think the angle where I feel like I didn't know how to was that despite having all of those things that you described without going through them like tick for tat, I still couldn't convince anyone to actually build it. So that's why I kind of like went forward. I was like, oh, how could I have actually done it? Like hindsight 2020, how could I have convinced folks? And despite knowing straight the amount of power of attorney forms that we processed every year, I felt like I didn't have enough. So I guess probably the best way to put it is that I didn't have enough to get support. My answer, right? So that's probably where like a lot of the friction comes in. And it's the first time I really told this story from the story of failure. And it's more that I had plenty of data, but I didn't have enough to.
I want to jump in here on a thing that he just said, which kind of paints him into a corner, right? And candidates do this a lot, which is, this is the first time I'm telling the story, right? Now, he was specifically targeting this is the first time I'm telling it as a failure, which the question wasn't about a failure. The question was about making a decision where you didn't have enough data. So it's not really talking about failure. It's about making decisions where you don't have enough data, and therefore demonstrating or being able to demonstrate after the fact that despite the fact that you didn't have enough data, you have good judgment based on the data you did have and you made the right decision. Stating up in an interview, well, this is the first time I'm telling the story, you're telegraphing that you haven't really prepared for the interview. And that's kind of that right there is bad, right? You don't want to be in an interview for a role that you really, really want, and kind of communicate or indicate to the interviewer that you didn't really prepare well. So that's one kind of takeaway here. But two, throughout this kind of walkthrough of his answer, despite all of the things that I said as follow-up questions, I was kind of beating him up a little bit, because I'm just, a product manager is what I know really, really well, right? And so when I hear product managers saying they didn't have X, Y, and Z, but it just, what they're saying doesn't make logical sense based on my experiences as a senior leader, where he's failing to really connect the dots is, what reasons existed that prevented him from selling his management team or his stakeholders on what needed. He said, despite the sheer number of volume of consent documents, right? Okay, but sheer volume is not a number, right? It's not a metric. It's not something that you can sell me on. And so all of his answer is basically calling into question his process as a product manager, right? What is he actually doing? How is he actually going about this? Because he's basically saying, I can't, but he never quite gets there as to why his process was falling down. Coupled with this is he never really paints the picture of the data that he was using, right? He speaks about it in kind of vague terms, but never actually gets into it. And so again, from a process point of view, as a product manager, I look at this and I wonder how much of this is now communicating a learned helplessness in the way that he behaves as a product manager inside of an organization versus someone who's kind of pushing forward and trying to advocate for change versus, well, I couldn't convince anybody. So, I needed to build it and I couldn't even convince people to build it. Therefore I wasn't able to do it. That's really not a great answer.
Convince anybody to build it in the long run, if that helps.
Okay. So I jumped in and had a lot to say, but apparently I was right at the end of the video anyway. All right. As always with these, I want to now read to you what I would have read into the room for this candidate had I been on the hiring loop. This is the assessment around our right a lot. Candidate suffered from poor story selection and lack of details in this answer block. Candidate could not demonstrate a working framework for how they make decisions regarding new product ideation and how they ultimately are making the case to their leadership to move forward. I would say, look, if we were focusing on simply our right a lot, is the answer higher or no higher? This is absolutely a no higher, because this product manager just did not communicate, again, in the context of what they shared, did not communicate an ability to drive new product ideation effectively inside of an organization. There was too much learned helplessness, too much high level, very vague discussion around how they approach the problems. And at the end of the day, the question itself was about making decisions when you don't have enough data. And the candidate couldn't even elucidate or highlight what data they did use to make their decisions. Never mind that didn't have enough of it, but how do they make decisions? What data are they using to drive their decisions? Didn't even touch on that. And so as a answer provided, it simply isn't enough for this candidate was targeting a senior product manager role, so called an L6 type role. It's just not good enough. And it would, as an interviewer, would cause me to kind of look around the room and say, okay, well, how else did this candidate do against the other leadership principles? Because from the depth that we had around the answers that we had in the room, it simply wasn't enough. And I would have concerns about process, and I would have concerns about judgment for this candidate. Now, it's important to highlight here that you as the candidate kind of control a lot of what I as the interviewer perceive about you, right? Remember, you only have an hour with me. And if you're lucky as an interviewer, I've read your resume and maybe I've done some prep work, but probably most interviewers don't. I say this again, they don't. They show up and they've got their list of questions that they think, they're the great go-to questions. But at the end of the day, they ask some of the same questions and they kind of go through the motions, but they haven't fully prepped. But most importantly, they haven't really done a deep dive on you. Unless they know you personally or they're coming through a personal relationship, they don't really know who you are. So the interviewer, my interpretation of you as candidate is wholly dependent on what you decide to share in that time slot. And unfortunately for this candidate, what he chose to share was his own words, a story that he had never told before. It didn't answer the question with regard to metrics, didn't lay out a framework for how he makes decisions, and ultimately demonstrated a learned helplessness that just kind of showed to me as a product manager within a large organization with maybe diffuse decision-making abilities, doesn't have the ability to drive ideas forward, right? And that's somewhat problematic when you're targeting a product manager role.